Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the founder and president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. As you can see, William Bell is not here yet. He was a tad late last week. He's running just a tad more late this week. I sent him a link. I'm going to do that again. As a matter of fact, give me one more uh, give me one more moment here, ladies and gentlemen, and I will send William another link. Matter of fact, it's even looking different this time. So I don't know. Perhaps there was a glitch of some kind, but I've sent him another link. So there we go. Hope you're having an absolutely fantastic week. I just got to share something with you, okay? Uh, as Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, forgive me my folly, okay? But I thought this was really, really cool. I went into the local credit union where I do a lot of my banking. Had to make a little bit of deposit, uh, very little. Anyway, um, it was a new kid behind the counter, and he just kind of looked at me for a moment. And see, I've been doing business with this bank ever since it opened its doors in Ardmore, and I've taken it for granted that everybody there knew me, and that's the way it's been for years. Well, they recently had a turnover, and so he just kind of stood there waiting for me to give him my name. And finally, he said, "You'll have to remind me what your name is." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. You're a newbie." I said, "My name is Don Preston," and he kind of stood there for a moment, and he goes, "What did you say your name was?" I said, "Don Preston." He goes, "I know that name." "Really?" He said, "Do you, are you on the internet?" I said, "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I am." He said, "Oh, wait a minute. You engage in religious debates." "Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I do." And he goes, "Hang on here just a minute." And he gets on the internet real quick and looks me up. He draws up, several of my YouTube videos. He said, "I remember you now." He said, "You came through Chick-fil-A in a different town, and we got to talking." And he said, "You shared with me that you're a minister and that you do YouTube videos and that you engage in public debates and everything." And he said, "I was really, really intrigued by what you shared with me about what you have your debates about." And he said, I was very, very interested in it. And you gave me a card, but I lost it." And he said, "Imagine now me coming to work at this bank and you showing up." And I go, "Well, that's pretty wild." And so we had a really good talk. And another one of the tellers, who was like two booths over, he overheard the conversation and he came over and had to ask some questions about my ministry and what have you. So it was a really, really cool time of sharing and asking questions and just back and forth. But I just thought I'd share that with you. I told my wife about it, and she got a bang out of it as well. Uh, that doesn't happen very often, obviously, but it is kind of cool when it does happen. That out of the clear blue sky, in a place that you really would never ever think that someone would recognize me for my ministry and what have you. All of a sudden, there it is. And by the way, that is the second time that has happened to me. It happened in Tulsa some years ago at the Cancer Treatment Center. Um, we were there for my wife's cancer treatments, and we had an appointment with the financial advisor, counselor, and he walks out and introduces himself to my wife, young guy, and she said, "Janice Preston," and I extended my hand to shake hands with him, and I said, "My name is Don Preston." He just stood there looking at me, literally just staring at me without saying a word. He said, "You're Don Preston?" "Well, yeah." I'd never seen this kid before in my life. And I said, yeah, yeah. And he said, I know you. I said, really? Where from? He said, YouTube. I watch you every single morning. Now, is that cool or what? I just had to share that. And I thought you might enjoy that as much as I did because it really is kind of cool. Okay. Well, I'm hoping William will join us here momentarily. Let me send him a text, by the way. Uh, let me see here. Oh, boy. All right, William. William is a little bit like me. He gets so busy, he forgets his appointments. I almost forgot yesterday morning. I had an appointment with a young gal that is a senior in school, and she was writing a thesis. She has to give a presentation on her thesis, and she wanted to come down from the Tulsa area and meet with me, ask me a bunch of questions, take a bunch of notes, because, well, again, this is a young woman that is going to give a presentation in a dispensational school where she's a senior, and she wants to give her thesis on why Jesus returned the second time in AD 70. And so she and her father came down. We sat down together at Starbucks and we talked and we studied for over an hour. And I had all but forgotten it until about 9:15. My wife says, "Don't forget your appointment. You've got this appointment." And I said, "Oh, of course, I remember that now." Well, I didn't. So I know how it goes, forgetting appointments. My wife is my scheduling book. So, with all of that said, all right, thank you again for joining me here on Two Guys in the Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. By the way, one more thing. I am super, super, super excited. I have written another book. Imagine that. This one is, as you can see, let me get this over here. Foretold. Let me see. Why is that not? Oh well. Foretold, failed, question mark, future question mark, or fulfilled. Now, this book is, even though it's only 121 pages long, something like that, even though it's a relatively short book, you are not going to find a more power packed book that responds to, that refutes the charge leveled against non dispensational people that we teach a replacement theology. Now, look, there are some people who do teach replacement theology in the worst sort of way. Israel fails, so God cut Israel off. It was an unprepared for contingency of her being cut off, so et cetera, et cetera. But instead of teaching an utter failure of Israel, instead of teaching a failure of God's plan, the reality of it is the Bible teaches that it was God's plan from the very beginning, starting in Genesis. It was God's eternal plan to include all men in salvation, not just Israel, but all nations of the earth. And I have to tell you that, like I said, this little book, one of the things that I have done in this little book, I have documented from some of the world's best scholarship, world class scholarship, and even admissions from the dispensational world that it is not the amillennialists and the postmillennialists that teach, quote, replacement theology. In fact, it's the dispensational world. I'm not going to explain that now, but guess what? They actually admit that. They actually agree with that. Have to read the book. Uh, this is my proof copy that came in today. All right. I've gone over it one time already. My wife will go over it again tonight. If we don't find any bugaboos, errors, slips, grammars, et cetera, then I'll approve this in the morning for publication in about 24 hours, they'll tell me if it's approved for printing, or they'll tell me, well, you got this and you got that. Yeah, 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 yeah. It's, Solomon said, of the making of books, there is no end. Well, I coined a phrase years ago, or a sentence, of the editing of books, there is no end. You can read a book, I don't care how many times, you can make corrections until you're tired of making corrections. You think you have it perfect, and you get it published. And when you get your very first supply in, your very first supply of inventory, generally speaking, you just flip it open randomly and you go, oh no, oh no, God, I can't believe that, because there'll be a big old typo, a grammatical error, or what have you. That's the way it happens. We'll see. Okay, again. So William and I have been talking about the Abrahamic promise and eschatology. I have been encouraging William. Some of you, and William said a lot of you, have been contacting him to publish his book that he published years and years and years ago, Eschatology, in the book of Galatians. It is absolutely fantastic. And so one of the things that we've been focused on, folks, that is so critically important is that while I have said, William has said, Larry Siegel says, all true preterists that I'm aware of emphasize that biblical eschatology is Israel-centric. That Paul said over and over and over again, for the hope of the promise made to our fathers, the fathers of Israel, that was the hope that he preached. Acts 28:16 and following. For the hope of the promise of the resurrection, Paul was on trial. Where did that resurrection doctrine come from? Guess what? It didn't come from 1 Corinthians 15 or 2 Corinthians chapter 5 or 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Paul's resurrection doctrine came from Moses, the law, and the prophets, Acts 26:21 and following, Acts 24:14 and following. Okay, so we've emphasized how biblical eschatology is, in fact, Israel-centric. It is not Israel only, as some have pervertedly said and do say, but as a matter of fact, Israel's eschatology is the assimilation of, the continuance of Abrahamic and even Edenic eschatology. As a matter of fact, I have been reading, again, I guess I missed this the first time, a book by Kim Burgess. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, Kim Burgess, entitled Hope of Israel and the Nations. And like I said, I evidently missed this the first time around, but let me read to you something that Kim Burgess says. Now, this book is based upon radio interviews that he and Gary DeMar had on Kim Burgess's view of eschatology. Now, there's a great, great deal of Kim Burgess's eschatology that I agree with. Probably the majority of it. There's some points of divergence, but I want to read to you what he says on page 2. He says, Israel's eschaton was a subset of the greater world history. Old Testament Israel was not the end of the road here. Israel was a God-ordained means to an end to deal with a bigger problem. And that problem is Adam and the fall. Namely, the sin and condemnation and death that came because of Adam's sin, Romans 5:12 through 19. God chose to create and use Old Testament Israel to concentrate sin there, that is, in Israel, so that sin could be dealt with once and for all there in Israel. Romans 5:20 and 21. Which is why the old covenant order existed. And he continues on page 3, speaking about how the biblical writers were Jews, and how they understood the narrative, the eschatological narrative. So he says, quote, they were all Jews. They were children of Abraham, literally, ethnically, and nationally. They knew the Abrahamic covenant, and they knew what was promised to Abraham. That is the foundation stone for doing biblical theology. You are not going to understand biblical eschatology unless you understand Abraham and what was promised to Abraham in the all foundational covenant made with him. Well, I could not agree more with Kim Burgess on those points that he was making. As a matter of fact, in my large book that I am currently working on, finishing up, it's currently being edited for me by my friend Tom George. But in the next to the last chapter, which is the Abrahamic covenant and the end of the millennium, I make the point that Kim Burgess does here, and I make it over and over. And that is, it's a point that William and I have driven home over the last several weeks. And that is, once again, even though biblical eschatology is Israel centric, it's not Israel only. The biblical story of eschatology goes back to the garden. It is carried into and through Abraham, and the Abrahamic inheritance is carried through Israel, but was to be fulfilled at the end of Old Covenant Israel's covenant age. That is to say, at the end of Moses and the law. Now, folks, I agree wholeheartedly with Kim Richardson here. If you do not understand the foundational nature of the Abrahamic promise to the entire narrative of eschatology, you won't understand eschatology at all. And yet I can tell you this. In the all-millennial world in which I was raised, I never heard sermons, lessons. I never read books by the scholars within the churches of Christ. There is Mr. Bell wanting to come and join us. I never heard any preachers discourse on the centrality and the foundational nature of the Abrahamic covenant. And so this is why I appreciate Kim Burgess's. Hello, William. Are you there? There you are.
Hey.
Hey.
I'm here. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, did you get my message?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay. I was stuck in traffic.
Oh, my goodness gracious. Yeah. Well, I was just sharing once again, and I was reading a couple of quotes from Kim Burgess. I don't know if you've read his book or not, The Hope of Israel and the Nations.
No.
Okay. Well, I was just reading some quotes from him in which he talks about the centrality and the fundamental nature of the Abrahamic covenant to understanding biblical eschatology. And he says, I'll just read the quote again from page 3. And he's talking about the biblical writers. Mm-hmm. And he says, they knew the Abrahamic covenant. They knew what was promised to Abraham. That is the foundation stone for doing biblical theology. You are not going to understand biblical eschatology unless you understand Abraham and what was promised to Abraham in the all foundational covenant made with him, unquote. So I thought that was just an outstanding quote. It touches on what you and I have been talking about for the last several weeks and how important it is to understand the Abrahamic covenant, or you will not understand eschatology at all. And just before you came on air, I was saying, in my upbringing in the Church of Christ, obviously we heard lessons about Abraham and the faith of Abraham. No question about that. But insofar as seeing Abraham as foundational for new covenant eschatology, I never heard a lesson on that. Did you?
No, not once.
No. And that's a huge failing in the all millennial world as a whole. And I would even go so far as to say it's also a failure in the amillennial world. I'm sorry, in the postmillennial world. In the postmillennial world, you have lip service being paid to Abraham and his covenant. And you even find commentators within the postmillennial world who say, well, yes, the Abrahamic promises were to be fulfilled at the end of the law of Moses. But then you have men like Kenneth Gentry, for instance, and I think I gave a quote from him last week, if I remember correctly, in which he says the ultimate Abrahamic promise will be fulfilled at the end of human history. That's quite a dichotomy. Fulfilled at the end of the law of Moses, fulfilled at the end of human history.
Sounds like those debates we had back in the 90s.
Yes, indeed. It certainly does sound like some of those debates. So anyway, William, I want us to get into Galatians chapter 4 this evening. And we say every once in a while that there are several chapter divisions in the Bible. Pardon me. First time I've sneezed all day long. Literally. My medicine must be wearing off. Have to take some more. So I apologize, folks.
No problem. Don just talking about the chapter divisions between chapters 3 and 4, and not just between 3 and 4, but between pretty much every biblical chapter in the Bible, where you're looking at the continuity of a subject that gets broken in two because of the chapter divisions. And one of the things that I'm always suggesting to people is to read the scriptures without paying attention to the chapter divisions. Just read it as if it's one subject all the way through, in terms of no break. And when you do that, you will find some consistency and harmony between the chapters. And sometimes you'll find I would call it a hard break, where there should be no break at all. And I think that's one of the situations between chapter 3 and chapter 4 of Galatians, because the chapter ends with speaking about being an heir, and or that's the end of chapter 3, and chapter 4 continues that subject in verse 1. So there is really no chapter division there. That's a continuation. I think Dunn's got his medicine, so we're going to turn it back over to him.
We shall see here. Well, yeah, and the point that you're making there, I do the same thing. I urge people, do not read the Bible and honor the chapter divisions. Now, sometimes for memorization's sake, yeah, that's helpful. I understand that. But I certainly do that myself. But for continuity of thought, for unity of thought, unity of narrative, it's just like, don't pay attention to chapter divisions. Some of the worst chapter divisions, I think, in the Bible, and I agree with you, so many of them, there's a bunch of them, but the book of Hebrews contains some absolutely atrocious chapter divisions the mind games that chapter divisions do with us causes us to go, what did he do here? Just shouldn't be them.
I can think of a few in the book of Matthew.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. I can too. No question about it. So, as you just pointed out, chapter 3, as we have it broken up into chapters, Paul says, number one, they're children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. We talked a good bit about that clothing. And by the way, William, I don't know if you looked at any of the comments under the video after I posted it on YouTube last week or not, but we had some people very, very appreciative of our discussion of that concept of clothing, being clothed with Christ, and how that continuous theme is found from the Old Testament right straight through the New Testament. It's a beautiful picture, to be honest about it.
Well, I'm very excited to hear that. I'm happy to hear that because, as you say, it's a very, very important theme, and I think it will help open the eyes and open doors in terms of people understanding what's going on there. So, yeah,
Yeah, and
very good.
perhaps we should pick up on one more element of the being clothed that we did not develop extensively. But the being clothed is very, very closely related to the wedding and the marriage motif.
Hmm.
You know, you find that in Isaiah chapter 52. Awake, awake, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O
Hmm.
Jerusalem. And that's wedding motif there. And so you come all the way through the New Testament, and in Revelation chapter 19, verse 6, you find the bride adorned for her husband, and her clothing is her righteousness.
Right.
And so these are some really, really beautiful concepts of being clothed with Christ, being clothed with righteousness, and being clothed, they would then be found spotless
Hmm.
and blameless before him. These are all interrelated subjects. So then he says in chapter 3, as he closes out, therefore there is neither in Christ, there is neither Jew or Greek. I got to get this up closer for my reading glasses here. Uh, Neither slave or free, there is neither male or female, for you all are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, as we pointed out, and I just want to hit this very, very quickly again, this passage is dynamite. It was societal dynamite in the culture in which Paul was writing. Just think about it in the context. There is neither male nor female. Now, some people, I think, misconstrue that, and they say, "Well, women have exactly the same roles as men today." I don't believe that's correct. I believe that there is basically an eternal hierarchy, if you wish to express it like that. Paul expresses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11.
Correct.
But it has to do with standing. It has to do with access. It has to do with inheritance, because that's what the subject is.
Correct.
And so he is addressing those who, under the law, being male or female, had everything to do with inheritance. I mean, if you're female, you were just about left out until you come to the book. Is it Numbers, where the daughters of
Zelophehad, yes.
Zelophehad?
Hmm.
I've always had trouble pronouncing that. But, you know, their father dies. They don't have any husbands. What are they going to do? Well, they received the inheritance because God granted that. But that was that was totally radically different.
Yeah, it was an exception
It was
made.
an exception. It truly was. So Paul is laying down some things here to show how radical life and blessing in Christ truly is. In Christ, there is no difference between men and women receiving the inheritance. We stand on equal ground insofar as faith is concerned, insofar as inheritance is concerned. Perhaps not in function, not in hierarchy, because Paul's pretty specific about that in 1 Corinthians 11. But nonetheless, insofar as standing and equality and inheritance, absolutely no difference whatsoever. You want to add some thoughts to that?
Well, yeah, even in the context of the slave, they had no inheritance. As a matter of fact, later on in the chapter here, as we get into it, he'll talk about the son versus a slave. And when you go back to, I think it was in the Code of Hammurabi that suggested that a slave could not even address his master as father. And if by chance the father addressed the slave as a son, then that entitled him to the inheritance.
Right.
So it was very important in terms of those distinctions. And Paul will get into that just, right there in verse 1, actually, of chapter 4.
Yeah. Okay, so he closes out chapter 3, in which he says, "If you are Christ, then are you Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Now, once again, we have to look at this concept of being an heir. Abraham was given twofold promises. He was given literal physical land promises and inheritance in the land promises. There were all sorts of physical blessings that accrued by being of the lineage, physical lineage of Abraham. All of those were fulfilled. But now Paul is addressing that spiritual seed. He'll get into that in chapter 4, 22 and following. There are two seeds that Paul wants to discuss. There's the physical seed, and there's the spiritual seed. And that spiritual seed didn't have anything to do with blood. It had to do everything with faith. Am I tracking that correctly?
Yes, faith and the promise of God.
Right. So now he says, once again, you're all the children of God by faith, not by physical lineage, but by faith. Okay. So then in chapter 4, and I know, in fact, before you came on air, William, I was saying we all got to keep pushing William Bell to publish his book on Galatians and eschatology to get it done. I'm not hearing a commitment, William.
I'm going to have to sit down and do that when I'm done painting my house.
So, all right. So, but chapter 4 builds on in an extremely, extremely powerful way what he has said in chapter 3. Now, I say that the heir, as long as he's a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is master of all. Well, what Paul's saying is that he is master of all in potentia, correct?
Yes.
Okay. As the heir, all of the slaves in the household would know this is the son, this is the child. He is up here. You are not an heir as a slave. You are a slave. And yet the son hasn't reached that point of inheritance. He hasn't reached the point of maturity. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here in just a moment when we get a little bit deeper into the verse. But again, Paul had just said, if you're Christ, then are you children of Abraham and heirs? Well, okay, William, they are heirs, but have they received the inheritance yet?
No, they have not received the inheritance.
Second question, follow up on that. Have they reached the point of maturity?
No, they have not reached the point of maturity.
Okay, so if they haven't reached the point of maturity, and if they haven't received the inheritance, then they're still to be considered as slaves, correct?
Well, he says they differ nothing in that respect.
In that respect. Thought I had you.
So
there is a fine line of distinction here.
Yes.
A fine line of distinction. So this child, as long as he's a child, before the time of maturity, is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the father. Now, William, the word appointed there is a really, really, really critical concept in biblical eschatology.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the Old Testament prophets spoke of the appointed time, which would be in the last days. And even though the book of Daniel doesn't use the term appointed time in Daniel chapter 2, or even in chapter 7, in Daniel 9 and in chapter 12 as well, when it's talking about the end of the 70 weeks, and when it's talking about the appointed time of the end in Daniel chapter 12, all of a sudden in Daniel 9 and in chapter 12, the appointed time of the end is the time of the resurrection. Well, William, you pointed something out last week about resurrection and sonship that I think segues beautifully just conflates beautifully into what we're talking about here about the appointed time set by the Father. You got a sonship. You got a sonship. He's an heir. He is an heir in potentia. But when does he get the inheritance? And how does he get the inheritance?
The inheritance comes at the time of the parousia. And, just as the scripture will say in Matthew 25, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So that's at the coming of Christ in glory. And there are other passages that, allude to it, like 1 Peter 1, 4 and 5, etc.
That's the passage I had in mind. In the inheritance, incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away.
Yes. And the second part of the question was it how or?
Yeah.
Okay. They receive it through resurrection. So, yes, that's the manner in which they receive the inheritance. It's through resurrection. And go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about Luke chapter 20 and Matthew chapter 20 as well. Luke 22, excuse me. And where Jesus said, those who are counted worthy, which is a fascinating terminology, to obtain that age cannot die, for they're like the angels, and they are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. Obviously, I don't have to tell you, William, that the opponents of covenant eschatology love to use this passage. Well, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, and and they neither on and on and on it goes. They're sons of God through the resurrection. They cannot die. Well, look, we're all going to die. And Preston, you're married. Bell, you're married. You guys can't believe that the resurrection has happened. Can you?
I think they missed the whole point of marry nor giving in marriage.
I do too.
And I have missed the point
on
marrying and giving in marriage. The concept there, first of all, it's in the present tense. So what the Lord is saying, he says, the sons of this age are marrying and giving in marriage. But those who are counted worthy to attain to that age, now they're not in that age yet. They're being counted worthy to attain that age, but he says in the present tense are not marrying and giving in marriage.
That's interesting. I've never noticed that.
It's very interesting and it's very powerful. So if he's talking about not marrying and giving in marriage in terms of believers marrying, then that's a total contradiction of what's being said. And it would negate all marriages.
Well, yeah.
Because he says the sons of this age are not marrying and giving in marriage. But here's the key to that. We just did a study on it. The key to that is when you look at, he's talking to the priests at this point. And the priests were, and the Pharisees were abusers of marriage. You remember Jesus' statement in Matthew 19. He's dealing with those who wanted to put away their wives for every reason. And then you have Malachi 2, where he's talking about treacherous, activity and all of that. But the point was, if you compare what he said regarding Noah, the people in the time of Noah, what did he say? He says they were marrying and giving in marriage, eating and drinking until the day came and the flood took them all away. There was something about the kind of marrying they were doing. Now, the story of Noah comes directly after it says the sons of God saw the daughters of men and they chose to marry whomever they would. And it's right after that God talks about the corruption of the earth, etc. Now, I know people, they read the book of Enoch and they think the sons of God there are extraterrestrial beings.
Yeah.
I don't. I think they're the same kind of sons of God in Luke. They're people. there's always a distinction made between the sons of God being believers and the sons of this age. And the sons of this age are always spoken of in a derogatory or negative
Oh,
sense
sure.
from that
Yeah.
perspective. So when you look, let's say, for example, in Matthew chapter 24, and notice something here that Jesus says in Matthew 24. Let's see, when he begins to talk about Noah, so it'll be verse
37.
37 and following. He says, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and did not know until the flood came." This is, these are corrupt activities in which they're engaging. They are denigrating marriage. And Jesus is saying that that's what these priests and those Pharisees were doing, but his disciples were not doing that. He didn't say they weren't marrying. They weren't participating in the kind of marrying and eating and drinking that those
In Noah's day were.
yes. And that's the same thing. That's why he makes that analogy with them on that. And it's beautiful when you draw it out. And what's also interesting is that Plato and many of the church fathers accepted that concept that there is no marrying, and that's where a lot of that comes from. It comes from Greek philosophy as opposed to Hebraic philosophy in terms of asceticism, disdaining marriage. You know what happened with the Rigen, right? And there was another of the fathers who Augustine was another.
Justin Martyr.
Justin Martyr, exactly. They all had very negative views toward marriage. Irenaeus was another.
Oh, yeah.
All had very negative views because they didn't understand the text. And it's been adopted by many to say, well, this is an argument against marriage. But no, Jesus is saying this about his disciples in present time, that they neither marry nor are giving in marriage. So he can't be talking about marriage as the holy institution that God made. He's talking about how marriage was corrupted as it was in the days of Noah.
That's really interesting. I've never heard it put quite like that before.
Well, I studied it, and I think that's what it is. I mean, it's a little more involved in what I briefly said, but I think it's a concept that people need to look into.
Let's face it, most biblical narratives are a whole lot deeper than we normally have examined them. I mean, that the more I study, the more I realize that, because there is just generally a world of thought. There's an entire, may I use the term, there's an entire database behind the story itself that the ancients would have drawn on to understand. We are divorced from, isolated from that database. And I'll just say this is one of the reasons I appreciate N.T. Wright, R.T. France, Scott McKnight, and some of those scholars. They do such a magnificent job of bringing out the common person's thought, their thought world, what the German scholars called the Zetzenleben. I think that's sort of kind of the way you pronounce it. But the everyday life, okay? And it makes the Bible come alive in ways that are just incredible once we tap into it. So, like I said, I'm more than intrigued by what you've touched the palate with tonight. You've given us a little bit of a taste. I started tracking with you very quickly there when you were referring to what they were doing in the days of Noah. God wasn't condemning them for eating and drinking. That's an everyday part. That's a part of everyday life.
Right.
He was condemning them because, to go back to Genesis 8:21, every thought and every intent of their mind and heart was to do evil continually. That's a summation of the society and in which Noah lived. Oh, yeah, they ate and they drank. They partied it up, in other words.
Yeah, but think about this now. Um, One of the statements Jesus makes in Matthew 24, in verse 48, he says, "But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants," that's a negative action,
Oh, yeah.
"and to eat and drink with the drunkards."
Yeah.
So, this is not just our normal eating and drinking. This
Right.
is eating and drinking with the drunkards. And that's the activity that was being condemned, along with the corruption as far as marriage was concerned as well.
I can see that. I'll have to give that some more thought, but I can see that. And that's very, very intriguing. Okay, back to Galatians 4. So here is Paul talking about being under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the Father. Well, as I made the comment, talking about the appointed time. Well, the appointed time throughout Scripture is eschatological. There's some exceptions to that. I mean, you have the appointed time of the harvest, just the regular agricultural appointed times and what have you. But kairos, that word that is very commonly translated as the appointed time or even the divinely appointed time, here, since it's talking about inheritance, so Paul is drawing on the natural world of his world, and that was both the Roman world and the Jewish world as well, of the cultural practices of a child. He is Lord of all, even though the time appointed for his inheritance had not yet arrived. So then Paul says something that, and I've been going around with a couple of guys on my YouTube channel, and I got to share this. One of them, of course, he's constantly on my YouTube channel telling me and reassuring me that I'm a heretic doomed for hell. He really, I guess he's afraid I'll forget that. And so he told me a couple of different times today that the law passed away at the cross, and that anybody that denies that joins me in heresy.
I read
And
that comment.
did you?
It
Okay.
was one on Facebook. It was
Yeah.
talking about the atonement. Is
Oh,
that the
yes,
context?
yes,
Yeah.
indeed. That, well,
I
no, that's a different discussion,
Okay, but
but
the
it's
same basic.
same premise, same,
Yes.
yeah. It When Preston says this, he's a heretic, and they, you know, well, I won't go into it. That take too much time to develop that, but I go through this almost every single day of individuals who are claiming that the law of Moses ended at the cross. Now, this one particular individual on YouTube recently, now not today, but recently he appealed to Galatians chapter 4, verse 3, where Paul says, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. So here Paul seems to be saying, okay, we're children, we were in bondage, we were the same as slaves, but now we're no longer under the law. Therefore, the time of the inheritance has arrived for us. So is Paul saying that kind of thing? That the Is he saying that the law had indeed passed away? I mean, I'm sitting here thinking it's not even close to what he's saying, but nonetheless, I want you to comment on it, of how people are trying to misuse this text to try to prove that the law had already passed away.
Yeah, it's basically what they do with all of these passages. They get one part of it and they hone in on that.
Not that much of
Yes,
it.
and ignore the rest of the text. And this is not an isolated context here in terms of this theme or motif being spoken of. It's also in Romans chapter 8 and says, in essence, the same thing. So if you were to read a few more verses, as he says, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But then he goes on and talks about when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. But notice, It is because they are sons, not matured, by the way, because the Spirit was given for that purpose to bring them to a state of maturity. That is 1 Corinthians 13.
Yep.
And
Ephesians
so,
chapter 4.
Ephesians chapter 4, exactly. Because you are sons, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Therefore, you're no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then not one who has inherited, but he says, then you are an heir.
Well, let's point something out here. You have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba. Abba was what a little bitty child would cry. It is not a term that a full grown, matured son used for father. This is Abba is it's a little bitty baby, infant that's learning to talk. It hasn't matured, and that's the point of Abba.
It's a great point. Great.
That's the understanding that I get from looking in the good historical critical commentaries. They just tell us, okay, Abba is a little boy, little bitty child. So it agrees perfectly with this idea of immaturity, and so therefore the time of the inheritance has not arrived because they're still having to call him Abba.
Right. And you alluded to Ephesians 4, that talks about them as children. 1 Corinthians 13 as the nepioi. They have not attained to that maturity. They have not attained to legal age. That's when you inherit. You can have children and you can designate them as the beneficiaries of all of your assets and everything in your will, but they can't touch it as long as they're under legal age. You can say, okay, it's yours, but you've got to be under some type of I can't even think of the word, but some type of governor, as the scripture here says. I'll have to just use that one. A guardian. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah,
a guardian.
Pedagogies.
Yeah. So you're under a guardian until you reach legal age, at which time then you are able to take over the inheritance that has been designated for you. But again, you're just like the slave who can't touch it until you reach that legal age, as far as that goes. So that's very important, that after they have been baptized, he said, you are sons of God by faith in Christ Jesus. So they've been baptized. That looks back to their activity and action before, but now having become a son, he says, you are an heir, and therefore looking forward to the receiving of the inheritance, which comes at the parousia.
Well, and not only that, he goes ahead to say, God said, for the son born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law that we might. That's in the subjunctive.
Correct.
That is a forward-looking thing, that we might receive the adoption as sons. So the text it literally is permeated with concepts of immaturity, of the promises that were to be received, of the potentiality of it, that is the subjunctive, the future aspect of it, and looking forward to the appointed time. So it's like you said, pardon me, so many of these people who want to argue, well, Paul said the law was nailed to the cross, so the law passed away at the cross. They're picking out about that much of a verse that sounds good, but they're putting a twist on it that is not contextual. And I got to tell you, I started to tell the story of this one fellow on YouTube today. He was insisting that, again, I'm doomed to hell, and that Paul was saying the law passed away at the cross. Well, I pointed out that, the very text that he was appealing to, Colossians chapter 2, Paul said that the last 3 feast days were, when he wrote, shadows of the good things that were about to come. Well, that's in the present participial tense. And I pointed out, here is Paul saying that the feast days were not fulfilled. Well, if the feast days were not fulfilled, then the law had not passed. And he writes back and he says, I'm not exaggerating here. Every one of the feast days were fulfilled at the cross, and they still point forward to the second coming. Wow. I had to point this out twice. You cannot say that the feast days were fulfilled, but they will be fulfilled at the cross without saying the law is still binding.
Or saying the judgment happened at the cross.
Or saying judgment and the parousia happened at the cross. And of course, that's what gets into this discussion of was the atonement completed at the cross?
Mm-hmm.
They want to compact and isolate the atonement, and they even want to separate it from the judgment and the parousia and the resurrection. So I asked this one individual on Facebook today if the atonement was finished at the Passover, then why did Israel even have a Day of Atonement 7 months later? In the Jewish mentality, in the Jewish calendar, Passover was one thing. Now, according to Tom Holland and Andrew Perriman, both, there were elements of atonement attached to the Passover. You know, that it is incorrect to say that the atonement was consummated at Passover, even though Passover had elements of atonement attached to it. Because again, if atonement and Passover are equal, if they are synonymous and synchronous, then you shouldn't have Passover as the first feast and Yom Kippur as the sixth feast. That just doesn't work chronologically. And I have been asking these individuals who attack us so vehemently for saying that the atonement was consummated at the parousia when the high priest came out of the most holy place to bring salvation. And they said, no, that happened at the cross. Well, I didn't realize that Christ came out of the most holy place at the cross to bring salvation. And secondly, why was there a separate feast day for Passover and for atonement if atonement was consummated at Passover?
And isn't there, when you look at the book of Exodus 12 and Joshua 5, isn't there a future emphasis on the fulfillment of Passover from that perspective?
Oh yeah.
When you look at it, because he talks about what it occurred, but he also talks about what would occur in the future regarding the Passover feast.
Oh yeah, in Joshua chapter 5, here the children of Israel have been wandering for 40 years. And the day after they enter the promised land, now remember, they celebrated Passover back there in Egypt, as you know. They kept it during the wilderness wandering, but then they kept it in a brand spanking new, significant way when they entered the Passover, entered the promised land. And Joshua chapter 5 is really an intriguing statement. They enter into the promised land, and the day after they enter the promised land, the manna stops, and they observe the Passover. And the text says, Joshua says, this day the reproach of Egypt has been rolled back from you, has been removed from you. Oh, wait a minute, you've been gone for 40 years, for crying out loud.
There you go.
But not until they entered. And so the observations that I have made is what you were getting there to there at a moment ago. The Passover was observed the night of its institution. It was observed during the wilderness wandering, and it was observed after they entered into the promised land. So it carried with it both a tonight, a continuance during the 40 years, and then a retrospective celebration after the fact. And I think that, to me, that's just really, really beautiful stuff.
Yeah, it is. one other word, and I know we don't have time to develop it at this point, but since we were talking about sons, there's that word adoption as
Oh yeah,
sons.
oh yeah. I thought
And
about that as we passed over it.
okay, all right.
Yeah,
Well,
we'll need to pick up on adoption next week.
okay, very
All
good.
right. All right. Good show, William. Thanks as always for being with me. Appreciate it very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'll say good night. God bless.
All right, good night.
Yeah, good show. Like that.
Okay, before I forget, Leora and I leave to go back to Africa
Okay.
on the 24th, and we'll be gone until the 11th of November. So that's next Friday.
Okay.
We leave.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to make some arrangements because Jan and I will be leaving. We're going to take a week vacation, and we're going to go to South Carolina. Boy, I've forgotten the dates, but I'll get Larry. I'll get him
Okay.
on board,
All
and
right.
maybe get him to get Rick Calvert again. I know they do a good job doing that together.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well,
Okay.
God bless, man.
All
Talk to
right.
you later. Bye bye.
All righty. Bye.